Welcome back to Purely IFS, a show that aims to support therapists and practitioners in using internal family systems as their primary approach with clients. I'm Gail Williamson.
And I'm Emma Redfern.
In today's episode, we're looking at some of the ethical aspects of working as an IFS professional.
It is, of course, a very different way of working in many respects. So those transitioning to IFS professional practice may need to reflect on their existing ethical framework, as it may no longer cover everything. And we thought it might be useful to talk a bit about this.
And in case anyone's parts want to switch off at the phrase ethical practice, it's actually a very interesting as well as important topic. So stay with us.
So I guess I want to raise the therapeutic relationship and issues that can often arise, because I think it can pose a lot of questions for those who are still new to the model.
Yes, because while the relationship with our clients is still key, that relationship is in the service of the other person's healing journey. In IFS, we don't consider the therapeutic relationship to be the primary or only mechanism of change.
Unlike, for example, attachment-focused approaches or something like schema therapy, where the relationship with the therapist is often seen as a source of healing, which of course places quite a weight on the therapist to be a kind of reparative parent figure.
Whereas, of course, in IFS therapy, self is the one who heals. So if the client has what they need to heal already inside themselves, and the model prioritises the use of certain protocols, it's understandable that some professionals may get the mistaken impression that it's a mechanistic model and that the relationship with the therapist doesn't matter.
Sure, and I guess even maybe go so far as to avoid a relationship with the client altogether and simply start a session with someone by instructing them to go inside and see what's there, which I have to say makes no sense to me and is ethically dubious. For me, the relationship with my client is still very important, and it's something I attend closely to. And this is primarily because I believe parts need to get to know and trust me as the IFS therapist. Otherwise, I really don't think we'll get very far. And actually, Emma, I thought I'd divert briefly to something that's very topical at the moment. The new Netflix drama series Adolescence. Have you seen it yet?
Well, I haven't seen it yet, Gail, but I know it's attracting a lot of attention and comment, so I do intend to make time to.
Well, it's brilliant. It highlights the misogynistic incel culture and online bullying. And episode 3 has some relevance to what we've been talking about, as well as being a great exercise in parts detecting. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the full series yet, so you may want to skip the next couple of minutes, but episode 3 sees child psychologist Bryony doing a pre-trial assessment of 13-year-old Jamie, who's been charged with stabbing a female classmate to death. Bryony has been working over a few meetings to build a relationship with Jamie and get him to open up, bringing him hot chocolate just as he likes it, and in this meeting offering him a sandwich. It's clear he likes talking to her, and then not long after, a part of him shows extreme anger, and it seems clear he really did commit the murder. Bryony abruptly tells Jamie that this is their last session and they won't meet again. It appears she hasn't ensured he understood the parameters or limits of their relationship, and he's angry, confused, and very upset. Essentially, he's a painfully insecure boy who believes he's ugly and who just wants to be liked and know that he's okay. And at one point, he's asking Bryony several times, "Do you like me? Do you like me?" And finally, "Don't you even like me a bit?" And she can't answer. It's devastating and cruel. She can't seem to find it within herself to say anything compassionate, which apart from anything else I can only imagine may compound Jamie's negative views of women that he's picked up from social media and increase the polarization inside him between highly sensitive parts and an angry firefighter trying to hide those vulnerable parts. And I guess I'm raising it here because I think a lot of people come to us with trust issues, fearing that the therapist doesn't really care about them, that it's just about money. And I fear that for people like this, that the way the interaction between Bryony and Jamie ended will only confirm their fears.
Absolutely, Gail. And that difficulty with trust is so often in the nature of relationships with traumatised clients who've been let down, betrayed, or badly hurt by significant others. But what you say about the adolescence drama also reminds me of why I'm so glad I found IFS. Unlike the character Bryony, we have the perspective that it's not all of Jamie, but part of him, showing such anger and using destructive strategies. Not that I want to belittle murder, of course, but with IFS, we also have practices that can help us access the incredible complexity of our own responses as therapists, which hopefully include compassion.
Yeah, as you say, it's not about minimizing Jamie's actions, but it is about realizing that if we condemn him as a person without seeing his complexity, then we're going to make the part of him that lashed out even more extreme, and that's not going to help anyone. Also, I think we all have within us that capacity for rage. It's not something we generally like to acknowledge, but I do think it's true.
So one point I wanted to make was around context. Differentiating context is important in ethical practice, where a cookie-cutter approach won't cut it. For example, how things are done in a training context are not necessarily blueprints for how to proceed with a real-life client, not least because the relational container is different.
Sure.
So along these lines, it's good to think about how we might handle, say, an inquiry from a client who just wants to try a few sessions of IFS, or one who says, I'd like to try some IFS alongside my usual. It makes sense to me to consider if I can offer an ethical and workable relationship along those lines, and do I want to agree to such arrangements?
From time to time, I get inquiries like this, where it feels like the potential client has somehow picked up that IFS isn't proper therapy, that it's just this thing that they come and have done to them for a few sessions to fix particular things, something like that. So I have to consider, does this fit with how I work and the IFS approach? I'm mindful that when therapists first qualify and when they're trying to build up a practice, there is an understandable tendency for us to accept a client on their terms rather than our own, where we'll say yes to the client who only wants to meet every second week or even monthly, for example. But then I often see that this dynamic continues, where a client in some way decides the therapeutic contract and the therapist accedes to this.
Yes, I think using a therapy that involves protocols often triggers in therapists parts who are frightened to impose or lead and who have the therapist follow the client. But a follow approach can be unhelpful. Instead of the therapist reflecting on their own values and what they believe constitutes good therapeutic practice. Ideally, the therapist is the expert of their ethical and trained practice, not the client. So when I ask a supervisee who's struggling what the therapeutic contract is, they might say to me, the client wants to work on such and such, which puts the emphasis onto the client as if the therapist isn't part of the decision-making process.
Sure.
So I might respond with, and you agreed to that? Or I might query the mono-minded wording and wonder if any translating to an IFS frame has taken place.
I guess that is how many of us were taught, to follow the client. But of course, the key issue with that is that once you know about parts, it becomes a question of which part of the client am I following? So am I following and actually colluding with, for example, the part that says, I don't want to do this parts work, it's weird, in which case we're not going to get anywhere.
Of course, in supervision, scared therapist parts may respond, but I can't make someone do what they don't want to do.
and they're falling back into the mono-mind view here. But it's actually not about this, about somehow forcing the client to do the work. We also don't want to make anyone or any part do anything they or it doesn't want to do. But what we do want to do is identify that there's a part who is resistant to the work, validate how it feels, explore its fears and practice persistence and patience to try and get the part into relationship with the client's self or with us as a therapist. That's our job.
Yes, and at the same time, we don't want to unknowingly end up in a polarization. If a part in the client is saying no, and a part of you is forcing its agenda, then it's potentially harmful. Plus, you are likely to create or strengthen a polarity between you and the client while missing their internal polarization. Broadening it out again, I think it's about the IFS professional having a sense of what is the therapist's responsibility and what isn't.
And a key thing here is our responsibility to be aware of any parts of us with a strong agenda in sessions with our clients.
Sure, therapist parts, like anyone's parts, can get frustrated and concerned. I work primarily as a supervisor now, and I can't make the part unblend, is often a cry I hear from supervisees. And then I might raise with them how while we know how to potentially help parts unblend, it's also ultimately out of our power and control. The willingness or readiness to unblend lies within the client's system and the part concerned. As IFS therapists, we offer a protocol or intervention to a client's part, and we address any concerns that might arise, but we don't make things happen.
Scared parts may still be wondering, however, but what if I really can't get a resistant part to unblend? And I think if a part is saying no to parts work and I cannot get any buy-in from this part, despite patiently persisting, then I think I need to be clear for myself and the client about how I work as a therapist and what I believe works. So it's not a case for me then of giving up on IFS and going back to a pre-IFS way of working. I am clear with the client that this is what I am offering, so that they have a choice as to whether to continue or not. So we're saying that ethically we need to know our own parts, and also in order to be an effective IFS therapist we need to know our parts and when they are activated, that's a big part of our ethical practice.
It is, Gail, and I think consent inside the professional is also a key part of offering IFS successfully. I've had experience of supervising therapists whose parts haven't all signed up for IFS. So there's a conflict. Some parts are attached to their pre-IFS ways of working because they feel confident using them and less confident with IFS, while other parts may have fully bought into IFS and call what they offer IFS. But if the IFS professional themselves isn't aware of this inner conflict, let alone actively leading their inner team, then this battle for control of the therapy approach is going to play out in the room with clients. And this isn't ideal, and I consider it dubious ethically. So if anyone listening is new to IFS, then please negotiate, seek consent and a workable compromise inside with parts before you get your clients caught in any confusion.
Particularly good to notice those parts of us who want to rescue the client, I think. Perhaps it's a client who is desperate and despairing and has tried everything but nothing's worked. They may come to you leading with a strong fixer manager that is now pinning all its hopes on IFS therapy to fix the person. And if your rescuer part dives in to meet that fixer manager's expectations, you're not only taking the side of this fixer manager, but self-energy is also likely to be blocked, along with any clarity and wisdom that comes with self's presence. So it's advisable to have an IFS supervision contract where the supervisor can help you parts detect, or we can even do explicit direct access with your parts that may have a rescuing agenda. just to say more about transitioning to IFS, because I think the huge paradigm shift that IFS does pose several difficulties for therapists, particularly if they're part of a state or private agency which has limits on the number of sessions or expectations as to how a therapist should work. This issue regularly comes up in my supervision group. So a therapist might be part of an addiction or trauma service that prioritises phase treatment and the teaching of self-regulation techniques to, as they would say, stabilise the client.
Which, of course, wouldn't be in keeping with a regular IFS approach.
No.
So then I guess questions for the therapist to consider might be, where am I in my IFS journey? How strongly do I believe in multiplicity and the existence of self? And do I want to advocate for the use of IFS in the service? Or alternatively, are there aspects of the model that I'm perhaps going to stick with, given my current work context and constraints? So, for example, am I going to work on helping a client think of themselves differently by focusing on detecting parts with them inside their own system and perhaps getting curious about parts in others who they may be in relationship with? That may be the most I can do.
Which can still be very valuable. And of course, all the while, I need to maintain my integrity by being transparent when asked by a client about my experience of working methods. If I'm newly trained or in training, I tell the client that so that they can choose not to work with me, or their parts can monitor safety more closely and so on.
Absolutely, Gail. It makes me think of my professional body's ethical framework, which highlights therapist trustworthiness as one of its principles. Clients place their trust in us, and we need to consider how we can respond appropriately and effectively. So even if I'm a seasoned trauma specialist, but I'm new to IFS, then I don't want to be using IFS with my most complex clients. Somehow, I need to develop my IFS skills and understanding gradually, beginning with less complex client presentations. Otherwise, I don't think it's fair on the therapist system or the clients.
So would we say, Emma, that it's ethical to use the IFS protocols without specific IFS supervision?
Oh, let's put ourselves on the spot, shall we? It's a great question. I've got two immediate responses. First, before I trained in IFS, I'd trained and accredited in EMDR, and I wouldn't have dreamt of working without having additional specific EMDR supervision from someone trained in EMDR and in EMDR consultancy, partly because it was so different to my basic talking therapy training. And second, my ethical framework states that as part of my commitment to clients, I review my work with clients in supervision. If I have clients coming for IFS or with whom I use IFS, then it makes sense and seems ethical to me to have IFS supervision. That's part of my identity and practice. So what are your thoughts on this, Gail?
Well, I agree with what you've said, Emma. I know when I first found out about IFS, I realised very quickly that this was what I'd been looking for so long, and I dived in. But it was important to me that I had weekly supervision to support this, which continued for a few years. Given the complexity of the model and the numerous questions that arise, I honestly don't know how anyone can offer the full model without specific IFS supervision. Of course, there is that transition period to negotiate. When exactly to switch over from your traditional supervisor to an IFS one. But IFS supervision groups or supervised practice groups for practicing the skills can help support this interim period.
And Gail, I don't know if you've done this yourself, but I cannot recommend highly enough watching recordings of yourself in action.
Yeah.
Understandably, it can be so easy for our parts to think, we know IFS, we've been doing it for years. But unless you have some thought out system for reflecting on your work, this may not be the case. Also, just telling what you did and bringing stuckness, self-report style, in IFS supervision may not really help you get fluent and flowing in IFS.
Maybe you can give us an example of what you mean, Emma.
Sure. Take the fourth F question, how do you feel towards the part? We obviously need to ascertain whether the client or supervisee actually answers that question and how.
Sure, where ideally we're listening for a feeling, but we may often get a more cognitive response along the lines of, I think the part is in my old school, or I was 12 here and really lonely.
Yes, and ideally, the therapist would have enough access to their own clarity and curiosity to notice, that sounds like a part speaking, and then have sufficient confidence, courage, and perspective to choose how to respond. But if you're watching yourself in a recording, you might spot that actually you've kind of just presumed the client or supervisee has answered the question and has access to self, and then carried on as if that were the case, instead of slowing down and inquiring more.
Yes, I think having the opportunity to view your own sessions is also useful for actually seeing and hearing your own parts. For example, the one that quickly comes in with reassurance. And if I spot that, then maybe I can get curious about what triggered that rescuer protector of mine to jump in. Was there something the client said, perhaps, that triggered an anxious part of me?
This may be a good point to say something about managing risk in IFS, since just because you're an experienced IFS therapist, that doesn't mean you can ignore risk or we can ignore risk. Yes, there may be an extreme part in charge with a client that is in crisis that we can try to negotiate with. But we also have to consider, hopefully in consultation with our supervisor, how much support we're able to offer a client in this predicament, both practically, for example, am I able to accommodate extra sessions, and proficiency-wise.
Sure, because while IFS is transformational, there are limits to what 1 hour per week can achieve. And certainly, if I have a client in crisis, I would want to be meeting at least twice a week. But also, how proficient am I in the IFS model? Do I have the skills and access to self that I need to effectively help a client who's being hijacked by extreme parts? So, professionals may still need to consider whether it's necessary to widen the circle of support around the client and, for example, contact the GP.
And I guess just to bear in mind, not from an overly fearful place, rather from a place of gathering information and arriving at greater clarity, what would your professional body expect in terms of safeguarding issues? It can be easy for our parts to minimise concerns or alternatively overreact regarding any risk or potential harm to a client from their system's intake of substances or regarding the safety of any minors in their care. Another aspect of ethical practice is to, in some way, review with the client your work together and its effects, which includes, of course, the therapeutic relationship.
Yes, social media often features tales of therapist misattunement, unfortunately.
Indeed, I encourage therapists to incorporate IFS thinking into any review process. So, in other words, ask which parts of the client are enjoying or okay with the therapy and which parts might be struggling. You might inquire if any have questions.
I like that. It's bringing the multiplicity paradigm into all aspects of the work.
Yes, and this isn't about giving your system an additional constraint or another must or should, but rather it's an opportunity to be curious in a slightly different way every so often, to explicitly nurture the therapeutic connection you're creating with your client.
I'm mindful that our ethical frameworks and expectations, which are there for the protection of the professional as well as our clients, are understandably written from a unitary perspective without explicit reference to parts. But that only means that we bring that perspective with us to our ethical understanding and practice.
Along with our understanding of self and self-leadership. I'm thinking in particular about self-care here. It's possible that leading with self in our work with clients and supervisees may mean we find the work less tiring than before we learnt IFS, but that still doesn't mean it's advisable to schedule, say, 8 clients a day.
I sincerely hope no one is doing that. I'd really worry for the 8th client. I think 4 is the recommended number of sessions a day by my professional body, and I stick to that so I can be as present as possible for each of my clients and still have time to fulfill the professional obligations that go with that. Note taking, which I think has to be more detailed in IFS, invoicing, continuing professional development and supervision, as well as any restorative activities.
In case any listeners want to follow up on some of the things we've only touched on, there are several resources available.
Sure, and we'll list them in the show notes. But an obvious resource is the supervision book that you edited, Emma.
Yes, and also for listeners in private practice in the UK, Kaz Binstead and Nicolas Sarantakis have recently brought out a useful book, Relational Ethics in Psychotherapy and Counselling in Private Practice. Also, I have an article in the BACP's Therapy Today on professional transitioning, and I spoke with Sally Brown about the subject on a Therapy Today podcast.
For something more IFS, Ash Chudgar has written an article, Consent and IFS Practice, for the PARTS&SELF magazine.
Thanks again for joining us on Purely IFS.
Bye for now.
Bye everyone.